Blood bloomed on the snow where a hawk had struck, a violent flower that steamed in the dawn like breath from an open wound, and Sophie May Whitlock watched the red soak downward through white crust as if the earth itself were drinking grief, as if winter were a mouth that would not close. Before 20 seconds pass in this telling, the frontier itself makes a small request of the living. Follow this trail, hold fast to this story, and be ready for part 2 when the next storm rides in. The cabin sat at the edge of a high basin, where the plains shouldered against the spine of the mountains, where elk tracks braided the drifts, and the wind carried the smell of iron and pine and old fire. 1879 by the almanac nailed crooked above the hearth, a year that did not care whether anyone survived it. The nearest town threw its dust 30 miles east when the snows flattened and the canyons released their clutch, a ghost town most days, a trading post only when the freighters rattled through with barrels of salt pork and coffee ground fine as grief. Her place had once been called a ranch by a man with large hands and larger promises. Then the man died, and the word thinned into a cabin, then a lone woman, then a rumor about a widow who would not leave the land that kept swallowing what she loved. She lived by measures a clock could not hold. A handful of chicory bitter on the tongue when the wind cut to bone, 3 logs and then 1 when the woodpile sank, 10 breaths to steady her hand before she lifted Henry's rifle from its pegs and set it back because she could not bear its weight. The fields under the crust still remembered summer, but their memories did not feed anyone. The barrel by the hearth kept ice like a stubborn heart. She learned to sleep in pieces, listening for the creek's muffled pulse beneath its lid of glass, for the groan of the barn roof's ribs, for the small sounds a house makes when it is trying not to collapse. The storm came down from the passes like a judgment. It scoured the ridgelines, shouldered the tall firs, leaned itself against the cabin until the chinking hissed with the breath of it. It ate sound until even her thoughts felt muted, as if the world had been packed in wool. In that kind of quiet, a person could hear the shape of their own loneliness, the exact outline of it against the ribs. She thought of Henry, of his laugh that used to live in the rafters, of the tiny box under the cottonwood where the snow always drifted deepest because wind loved to linger where it had taken something. She lit the lamp and watched the flame cower, then straighten, the way a woman 4 winters alone teaches herself to do. 7 knocks carried through the howling like a pattern stamped into storm, measured, unafraid, as if the wind itself had been taught to keep time. She opened the door with a body that moved as if it belonged to someone else. They were shadows backed by snow glare, tall as door frames, wrapped in fur and hide and the weather's hard respect, faces wind-burnished, hair braided tight against the teeth of winter, bone work at throats that caught the lamplight like stars that had been traded for heat. Comanche men by the look of them, travelers rather than raiders, riders carrying purpose rather than hunger. They crossed the threshold in silence that listened rather than took, leaving their boots clean by the jam, leaving the storm outside to pace and snarl at the door it could not open. The inside air shifted with their arrival, warmed by more than the stove. Their movements folded easily around hers, as if the house had simply grown to fit them. Furs spread, breath eased, shoulders lowered into a kind of tired that does not argue. One stirred the coals with care a priest might envy. Another braided hair back from a scar not new. A third drew a thread through rawhide with hands that remembered smaller work. She ladled stew with a caution that only years of shortage teach, still finding enough to place bowls where hands waited without reach. They did not ask, she did not refuse. The house learned a new version of quiet, the kind with room inside it. There was one she kept noticing the way a winter eye finds the strongest tree without meaning to. Broader through the chest, a scar that crossed the jaw like a river advised by rock, eyes the color of snow shadow, not cold, but deep. He took food as if it were a gift he intended to repay, sat near the stove and fed it as if it were an animal with a name.
In the night, when their breath made a low tide across the floor, she stepped among them with quilts saved for the kind of mercy that burns a little when you offer it. She laid one across each body, and when the quilt reached the scarred rider, his hand closed softly over the edge, as if he understood this was ceremony, as if he had been a boy in a house once where women tucked men in, and winter was merely a long thing you survived together. Morning found him at the woodpile, shirtless in the kind of cold that teaches bones their true names, the clean strike of steel on oak like a hymn that kept time with his breathing. He worked the way men work who have known hunger in winter and water in summer that kills. The others cut a path to the creek, reset a fence line hunched by snow, mended a hinge with a length of rawhide she had given up on. The barn lifted its shoulders and remembered its purpose. The hens found their small gossip again. Her lungs expanded as if the storm inside them had been convinced to move on. For days the world reduced to work, to the rhythm of hands doing what hands are for. A rabbit hung from the eaves and became stew. A porch plank replaced the one that had threatened to break an ankle for 2 winters. The wind shifted from threat to witness. The sky found a silver that did not promise, but did not lie. The men spoke little, and when they did, their words seemed to come from the same place their tools did, built for use rather than show. She learned the weight of their footsteps, the way each one returned to the door. The scarred rider stayed when the others left. They did not make a ceremony of it. Furs rolled, hands clasped, horses shouldered drift and climbed, the line of them becoming shapes swallowed by the white world. He remained as if he had always been part of the house, and the leaving simply revealed it. A stone hawk appeared on the table, smooth and round and fierce in a small way. A creature carved from patience and carried miles to be set down like a promise. She held it as if warmth could be folded into stone and keep. Days layered. She found herself moving differently around his presence, the way a person moves through a room where music is playing softly. He did not crowd her with words or need. He made a rope line from the porch to the barn that found her hand in the next storm like a friend. He fixed the hinge the right way with a dowel fitted clean, not the way she had taught herself to accept. He brought back 2 trout from the creek with the kind of joy a hard man allows himself when his hands remember a boy, and he set them aside silently, allowing her to claim the cooking that made a house feel like one again. At night, he slept closest to the door, and the fire never died if she woke. Tracks in the snow appeared the morning her breath hung heavier and the wind returned with that knife-edge whisper that makes animals nervous. 3 sets, a circle made by men who were either lost or pretending they were not. The scarred rider looked into the trees, and the quiet around him changed from rest to listening with his whole body. He walked the fence line and returned with a frown that fit his face like it had been carved there on purpose by a different winter. He sharpened a knife by lamplight, slow and unhurried, the way a man sharpens who has no interest in showing anyone he knows how. The men came at noon when the sky kept its light close to its chest. 3 riders slumped forward with the careless confidence that grows in men who have never been alone in snow long enough to learn manners. They threw their shadows long across the yard and left their horses standing where they pleased, eyes sliding over the house as if it were a thing that had not yet decided to be real. She recognized one by the shape of his meanness. The basin had known his name long enough to be tired of it.
The scarred rider did not reach for anything. He simply stepped to the place where men who will not bend plant their feet. Anger is a sound even when no one speaks. The first shotgun lifted because impulse is a habit, not a plan. She had Henry's rifle in her hands with the small shame that she had always hated the feel of it, and she chose now not to hate it. Pulled the trigger and watched the bark lift from the cottonwood instead of the man's hat. The flinch it bought was enough. Bodies collided with snow's muffled violence, a blade's bright lesson across a thigh that would end a fight without ending a life. A man dragged to his own breath, steamed in surprise at being thrown like a child. The one with the mean eyes found his courage dissolve like sugar under rain and backed away with boots that remembered how to be quiet.
When the trees took them back, the yard felt bigger than it had an hour before, not because danger left, but because something had decided to stand up inside the house and keep standing. He rinsed his knife in the creek, and the water carried the red away as if it had been waiting for something to do. She stood beside him with hands that did not shake and understood that survival is sometimes the same shape as tenderness. She fed the stove as if fire had been invented for this one night. He made new arrows from dowel stock he'd found in her attic, wrapped fletching with a care that turned a work table into an altar. A braid of sweet grass swayed from the peg by the door where her father's hat had once hung, the scent moving through the room like a lesson in keeping. When sleep finally found her, it brought a dream of Henry that did not ache. He stood at the fence line with his hat back and his hand lifted not to wave, but to bless. A smile not made of apology, the kind of smile a good man gives when he understands someone else will carry what he cannot. She woke to the smell of coffee that was not coffee, chicory steeped so bitter it steadied a person, and she realized her mouth no longer tasted like grief every morning. The twist arrived without fanfare, tucked into the pocket of a coat that smelled of horse and wood smoke. It was a ring wrapped in flannel, worn thin by the rub of miles, gold scratched but true, the inside of it notched by a maker who had stamped a hawk so small you could miss it unless your hand had once worn it. She knew it by weight before she knew it by sight. She had taken it from Henry's hand before the fever burned him too hot to keep it, then tucked it into a box beneath their bed with a lock of hair that had faded almost white. When he died, she buried the hair, and the ring vanished with the men who came to help and forgot to remember what does not belong to them. The scarred rider set it on the table as if laying down proof that the world was sometimes a circle, not a line that cut everything in half. He did not speak. He did not need to. There was no dialogue here, only the kind of telling that lives in eyes, in the angle of a jar when a promise has been kept. Memory put the rest of it together with a speed that hurt. Henry, on a summer trail 2 winters before, horse fallen lame near the red bluffs where the river twists like a knife. A small band of Comanche riders finding him fever-shaken and half-talking to the sun. A man with a scar watching him die gently and agreeing to carry his last hungers to the woman who had sewn hawks into quilts and braided her hair before storms. A hawk carved from stone because words unspoke still needed a body. A promise that took 2 years and an ocean of snow to arrive at her table, wrapped in flannel. The world brightened around the edges and darkened in the middle. She felt warm and cold at once, as if a door had opened inside her and let weather in. She closed her hand around the ring, and it fit her palm like something had found its way home and needed only to be warmed back to life. She put it on a rawhide thong and looped it around her neck, where it lay against a pulse that had been steadying itself since the first knock. Work returned as if nothing had changed except everything. They moved through the days like 2 people who have been handed back an hour that had been stolen. He taught the woodpile to rise like a wall. She taught a stove to heat a room without burning its patience. He taught the chickens to trust dawn again. She taught the house to hum. The hawk on the table watched. Then the basin roused itself into trouble the way places do when men decide kindness looks like weakness. Lanterns were seen at the edge of the cottonwoods at hours good people sleep. A bottle broke by the barn without being thrown. The deputy from the town that was mostly rumor rode up with a paper stamped by a man in a room who had never seen this land and said it belonged to another now because a tax had been missed while a woman was busy burying her dead. The scarred rider read the deputy's face rather than the paper, and saw the same meanness that had circled before, but this time dressed in law's borrowed coat. The basin taught them to prepare like a prayer.
She packed flour in sacks and moved them under the bed as if hunger could be fooled by a smaller path. He strung a bell line across the back trail, a little iron clapper that would wake the bones. The sweet grass by the door doubled. The hay moved away from the walls. She filled the lamps but set them low so darkness would remain a kind of shield. He checked the creek trail and found boot tracks that did not know how to be humble. The hawk on the table felt heavier when she lifted it, as if stone could absorb worry and keep it cold. The drifters returned with more bravado and a little worse aim. The deputy came with them because men who cannot stand alone often choose to become a crowd. The world narrowed to breath and choices. Snow fell the way an old man talks, slow and full of what it has seen. The wind made sentences in the firs. Horses tossed their heads and stamped a rhythm that promised nothing. Violence came and passed like weather does when it meets something that will not move. No one died. A thigh learned what a blade can do when it is merciful on purpose. A shoulder found the ground and remembered it is part of earth, not separate. A revolver jumped from a hand like a spooked frog. The deputy discovered fear makes boots heavy. They left pieces of themselves in the yard and took away the shape of a woman and a man standing where winter says no one stands for long. She slept afterwards with the rawhide ring warm against her sternum and woke to the sound of the creek explaining itself in Thaw's first language. It was only a word, but it reminded the basin that spring is a promise even in places that keep too many ghosts. She looked at the mirror a trader had once swapped her for a pail and saw a woman whose hair lay braided clean for the first time since grief had cut it with dull scissors into a shape that could not catch a comb. Her face had edges again. Her hands looked like they had done a day's work and wanted more. Then the true winter came back not in weather, but in men. It came with an army sergeant's braid and the flat, patient eyes of officials who believe paper is stronger than land. It came with a priest who had baptized and buried everyone in the basin and now stood on the porch with his hat held to his chest like he hoped his show of sorrow would hide the way he had signed something somewhere that paid for a new roof on a church that already shed water just fine. It came with Cal Dorsey again, standing just behind the sergeant like a dog who has found a bigger dog to stand near. It came with a notice of seizure and a rumor of rail surveys, a track planned to cut the basin like a new scar through a healed wound because men in Denver preferred straight lines to rivers' wandering logic. The scarred rider knew one of the soldiers. Recognition hit him the way lightning hits an old tree, not to destroy, but to remind it of fire. The soldier had once ridden south with a pack that hunted riders like him for wearing the wrong story on their faces. A brand, a memory, a sister's scream on a day when summer had more heat than mercy. All of it appeared in his eyes and then went back under the surface, like a big fish that only rises when the lake convinces it to. The priest asked for charity in the language of ownership. The sergeant asked for compliance in the language of orders. The deputy asked for a signature in the language of theft. The basin waited for a shape to move. The hawk on the table watched the door. Sophie did not bend. She had bent too often for years that did not deserve it. She thought of Henry's last summer and of the ring that had crossed a winter to find its way home. She thought of the way the scarred rider had held back his strength as if it were a horse that might bolt and ruin everything, of restraint as a kind of love. She thought of the narrow ways the world tries to make women move and how wide the snow makes everything look when no one is telling it what to do. She stood beside him the way a fence stands beside a field, not to keep anything out, but to show where the field begins. In the night, while the sergeant made his men stack wood for a camp that would smoke a warning into the trees, while Cal laughed near the fire as if he had not learned anything from his last bruises, the basin's sky pulled its clouds over the moon and made the world small again, just cabin-sized. Inside, objects claimed meanings they had always wanted. The quilt across the chair became a story that did not end in burial. The comb on the shelf became a little tool of hope. The rawhide ring became a vow no church could own. The hawk became a kind of guardian. The rope line to the barn became a prayer. Sleep, when it found her, floated like ice in spring water, fragile and beautiful, melting as soon as it touched warmth. She woke at nothing. Then she heard it, not wind, not hooves. A sound so soft it might have been a moth's wing on glass if the night were gentler. A single tap at the back window, the small window no one used because it looked on the deer trail that only she and the hawk knew. A sound like a fingertip or a mercy. The scarred rider lifted his head before the second tap and moved silently across the room as if the floor loved his feet. His hand hovered over the latch and then withdrew, not out of fear, out of listening. He looked back once, and his eyes asked a question that could not be spoken in a story without dialogue. She nodded, because some answers live in the bones. He opened the shutter the width of a breath, and Winter's knife reached in without apology. A face hovered in the dark beyond it. Not a soldier, not Cal, not any man she had known by harm. A woman's face, wind-burned and steady, a braid thick as a horse's mane laid over one shoulder, a child's small hat clutched to her chest like an offering that had crossed more miles than shoes. Behind her 2 more shadows waited at the deer trail's bend, riders whose mounts did not snort at campfire smoke because they were used to staying downwind and unseen. The woman raised the hat slowly, and the lamplight found a stitch on the brim so specific the world narrowed to it. It was a double hawk, 2 small stitches facing each other like birds in flight, a pattern Sophie's hands had invented one winter when she believed needles could hold the world together. The brim also carried a mark pressed into the leather that matched the gold ring against her skin, not because a jeweler had made it, because a man with a scar had taken a heated nail and reminded leather what a promise looks like. The woman mouthed a name the night could not carry. The child behind her shifted, and Sophie saw a face in the shadows that her body recognized before her mind did. A geometry of cheek and brow and left ear tilt that the mirror of a buried morning had always kept at the edge of sight, like a mercy too big to hold. The world rocked gently, and then steadied. She understood a thing that made every winter in her chest lift its head. Her child had not died. The fever had taken breath and given it back to another pair of lungs, the kind of miracle that leaves everyone angry until they learn the shape of it. Henry had begged a woman in a summer camp by the Red Bluffs to carry what Sophie could not for a time, while he rode for a doctor through heat that burned men as if they were paper. And then the doctor had arrived to a body already empty, and a woman carrying a life the basin had believed buried. The winter that followed had scattered everyone like birds rising from a shot, and by the time the world bothered to slow, the child had a name given by a tongue that loved wind and far horizons, a home that moved with seasons, a mother who had wrapped him every night in quilts stitched with hawks. The woman's eyes said all of this and more with a steadiness that did not ask for forgiveness and did not offer apology because none was needed. The scarred rider understood and did not flinch. Sophie reached for the latch as the sergeant's campfire hissed in new snow, and Cal Dorsey laughed at a story he would never tell again once the sun decided what to do with him. Her hand touched the cold iron. On the slope above the cabin, a match flared in a wet glove and struggled, then caught, then rushed like a small thing that believes it has become large.
Another match ignited 50 paces to the east where the rope line met the barn, and a shadow pinched it out with fingers that did not need to be taught carefulness. A third match bloomed closer than either of the first, at the corner of the woodpile where saps weep in spring and tar makes fire move like a living plan. The match did not belong to a soldier or a deputy or Cal Dorsey. It belonged to something older and meaner that wore many faces and no face at all when it was dark, the part of men that hates what it cannot own. The window was half open now. The woman outside lifted the child, and Sophie saw two futures at once, both so bright they hurt. Behind her, the scarred rider straightened as a shadow detached itself from the woodpile with a bottle in its hand and a rag at the mouth and a spark growing teeth. The bottle lifted. The hawk on the table seemed to look at both of them at once, at the child and the flame and the rawhide ring and the rope line and the priest's hat and the sergeant's braid and the soldiers who would sleep too long because good men had added whiskey to their coffee and belief to their orders. The night held its breath, the way a choir does when it knows exactly how the next note should sound. Then a footstep on the porch that no one had counted. A weight that did not belong to any soldier, a weight that remembered the house from another life, the exact creak of the board outside the door that Henry had always promised to fix in spring and never had, a foot that found that memory and made it sing. The knob turned from the outside with a confidence that did not ask permission and did not offer warning. The door began to open. The bottle's flame reached the rag and raced, joyous and bright. Sophie's hand tore the shutter fully wide, and the winter rushed in with a white roar as the child's eyes lifted and found her with the simple certainty of a compass needle finding north. The scarred rider moved, not toward the bottle, not toward the door, not toward the soldiers or the priest or the deputy or the woman or the child, but to something only he could see. Something that had been tracking him through seasons and promises and snow and rings and hawks. The night broke along all its seams at once, and the basin tipped, and the story that had been waiting with its breath held finally exhaled. Part 2 waits where the door meets the flame, and the past steps over the threshold.